Welcome back, everybody, to the Law of Trusts. We're continuing talking about the nature of charitable trusts in this lesson, focusing on the question of what is actually a charity. This is going to be an interesting question because it's actually a little bit more complicated than you might think. This lesson, like I said, we're going to define a charity for the purposes of charitable trusts before when we look in the next lesson at the formal requirements for the creation of a charitable trust. So this is less really a legal question, although we will be referencing law in relation to this. And really we're going to be saving the technicalities, the specific legal technicalities, to the next lesson, and we'll get to that when we get to that in future lessons' time. So fundamentally, what is a charity? The definition of a charity has always been very difficult to ascertain because it's quite broad, really, what could constitute a charity. We don't see until the 2006 Charities Act, which then gets amended by the 2011 Charities Act, legislation that properly comes up with something of a definition of charity. So it's only till relatively recently, in fact, very recently, if we compare this to the entire history of English law, that the idea of what a charity actually is and what could fall into the remit of constituting a charity actually is coherent, is actually given some kind of meat to it, given some kind of meaning. So prior to this, the definition was left to very old statutes and also to the case law. For example, the case of Badinley versus the IRC, Inland Revenue, we see here as part of the judgment by Viscount Simmons, quote, while no comprehensive definition of legal charity has been given either by the legislature or in a judicial utterance, there is no limit to the number and diversity of ways in which man will seek to benefit his fellow men. And this really, Viscount Simmons here is really giving us an indication of the problem. The problem is, he's right, there is no limit to the number and diversity of different ways in which man can seek to give benefit to his fellow men. You can give in a way that is beneficial to somebody else. If that is all that we mean when we talk about something being charity and something being charitable, and as a result of which should therefore fall into the legal definition of charity, then what are we going to do? We've got a big problem here because there is a very large and almost unlimited number of ways in which we can achieve this goal. Well, we can firstly go to the preamble to the Charitable Uses Act from 1601 to give a bit of an indication as to what may or may not constitute a charity or a charitable purpose. And really, this legislation here, or the preamble to this legislation, essentially provides the definition of a charity that is more or less used all the way up to the present day, but just maybe in different terminology. And so this list provides the purposes which can be regarded as charitable. And I'm going to read this out, and it's going to be quite convoluted and complicated. Remember, this is language from 1601, so it is not exactly the most up-to-date linguistic use of the English language. This was language that was written in 1601 during the reign of Elizabeth I. So I'm going to read it as follows. Quote, the relief of aged, impotent, and poor people, the maintenance of sick and maimed soldiers and mariners, schools of learning, free schools, and schools and universities, the repair of bridges, ports, havens, causeways, churches, sea banks, and highways, the education and preferment of orphans, the relief, stock, or maintenance for houses of correction, the marriage of poor maids, the supportation, aid, and help of young tradesmen, the handicraftsmen and persons decayed, the relief or redemption of prisoners or captives, the aid or ease of any poor inhabitants concerning payment of 15s, setting out soldiers and other taxes. So really what is considered charitable is basically anything that could fall into this list. And they do add, and obviously the Charities Act does add a lot more other things as well. But these encompass some of the most important, the main ones. So the relief of poor people, for example, the relief of poverty, that's one of the main elements of charitable status. The advancement of education is also one such example of this, as well as the protection or the support of those who are soldiers and who have returned from war is also an example. Persons who are ill, or who are in maintenance of houses of correction, preferment of orphans, all of which are examples of charitable purposes that can exist and that continue to exist. Now, while obviously a very broad and a very encompassing definition in terms of listing basically almost everything that could be a charitable purpose, it should be noted that it is actually not even an exhaustive list. Even this isn't an exhaustive list, because it is seen to be the case that the concept of charity is one that shouldn't really have a very specific rubber-stamped definition. Rather, it's an idea that can develop over time. New charitable causes and new charitable purposes may develop over time. Take, for example, protection of the environment as a charitable act, as a charitable donation that you can make. Prior to the 20th century, prior even to the Industrial Revolution, the idea of caring for the environment wasn't as prevalent as it is today. The idea of the environment and climate change and all these things didn't even exist until what, the 1950s, 1960s, and then into the 1980s. So this is an example of a charitable purpose that has developed over time and grown out over a particular time. Now, you could also conclude that charitable purposes exist when new events take place. So even though if you donate, for example, to a Ukrainian support or support for individuals in the Gaza Strip, these are, of course, new events. These are new wars that have taken place in the last 3 or 4 years, but they still represent essentially the broad category of humanitarian aid or humanitarian relief or something like that. The case of Rhys Strakosch from 1949 gives us an illustration at 537 of what we really mean by the all-encompassing definition of charity. They say, with reference to the 1601 preamble, that, quote, the preamble set out what were then regarded as purposes which should be regarded as charitable in law. It is obvious that as time has passed and conditions changed, common opinion as to what was properly covered by the word charitable has also changed. Another really, really good example of what could be considered charitable now that wasn't considered charitable 100 years ago is charitable support for mental health funds. Mental health, definitely did not really exist in 1601. The attitudes towards mental health didn't exist until the what shall we say, the 1960s, 70s, 80s, maybe even the 90s, and even in the 2000s, we see a huge development in the ways in which mental health has been approached in society. And that's another example of how charity has changed over time, and so as a result of which we can't really come to a conclusion as to a single definition of what may be charitable now, because that can change in the future.